I want to take you back to 1970s Detroit, Michigan. There's been a lot of effort for women to be able to get access to the administrative jobs in the car industry, right? And they're finally able, these jobs were actually mostly held by men, and the women have finally fought to get into the administrative jobs. On the factory floors, black people have fought hard so that they can actually have jobs on the factory floors after lots and lots of historic racism, even within labor unions, even. Anyhow, 1970s, black women notice that they're getting refused jobs on the factory floors, not because they're black, but because they're women. And they're getting refused jobs in the administrative positions, not because they're women, but because they're black. They take a case that goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and they lose the case. Their argument is, we're being doubly discriminated against. And the court says, but we've put in protections for black people on the factory floors, we've put in protections for women in the administrative offices, there's nothing we can do. This is actually the origin of the term intersectionality. And I wanted to start the conversation there because over the years, we've started to conflate intersecting identities with the term intersectionality. And I'm just asking you to indulge me and let me just explain. Intersectionality isn't just about our multiple identities, although those matter very much, and we will definitely talk about those this afternoon. The important thing I want to make sure we all understand as the basic definition of intersectionality is it's the ways that multiple oppressions intersect with each other, not just identities. Okay. So I have an identity as a singer, I have an identity as a speaker, I have an identity as a writer. I'm not oppressed because of those things. I have an identity as a woman and not what we would call a gender-conforming woman, as we were talking about in the last session. I have an identity as a South Asian. I have an identity as an immigrant. I have an identity as a queer person. I do experience oppression because of those parts of my identity. Those are where the intersectionality shows up. Intersecting oppressions and intersecting privileges. English is my first language. I am, by and large, read as, gets trickier as time goes on. I am often read as straight. I am often read as gender-conforming female. So I actually do get privileges, right? I have a level of education. When we talk about intersectionality, what we're talking about is the places often that we don't have control over, where we experience benefits from a system that's set up to benefit certain people, or we experience marginalization because of those same systems. So I hope that we're getting to talk about our intersecting identities and how we bring the fullness of our being into community. And I would just want to distinguish that from intersectionality, which is also really important to talk about, and is about the systemic injustices that don't get fixed just by us claiming all of our identities. Intersectionality only gets fixed by us using our collective power to change systems and structures. So that was the thing that I wanted to start us off with, and then I want to turn the floor over to what you all want to share about.
I think one of the issues that we struggle with as a church always is finding ways to be advocates across intersecting lines. And we find ourselves involved in so many things, sometimes it's hard to be a voice for all things, to all people. And when you're welcoming all people, you find yourself as a voice of all things to all people. So finding the commonality in those intersectionalities, but then also starting to break them down. Because one of the things we've learned over the last year in our conversations in the pandemic is that some of the identities we claim aren't really intersecting identities. They are intersecting political categories to continue oppression that many of us might identify as white. But white's not a real thing.
Right.
White is something that Latinos were included in to help keep the numbers up for the white community. That Asian
But
community,
Latinos don't actually get the money from.
exactly, that we conveniently include the Asian community in sometimes, so that we keep numbers. But these are the same people who are warring in gangs of New York and other movies that we've watched and learned about history from these fictional movies. But we've learned that there used to be Italians and Irish and Germans, and that taught us about our roots.
Yeah.
They had culture and ancestry. White doesn't have a culture.
Yep.
Right.
You can't say, what food did white people give the world?
Right.
What dress or art did white people give the world? No, it's a category that we made up to maintain a majority over people of color, and to keep finding allies that are enough like us that we can tolerate it and keep our power. And as we were doing studies on racism and things over the summer, we were reading White Too Long and other books and seeing that this was a made-up thing. But then we started through June looking at all the plus identities. You know, we knew the L, G, B, and T, but the pluses we need to dive into. And the more we dove into it, we realized asexual is not a spectrum. Or it is a spectrum, but it's something that we're all on. Because it doesn't matter if you identify as gender conforming or not in a relationship, you are either a highly sexual person or a non-sexual person. And it doesn't matter what your identity is. Every human being fits on that. Just walk into a junior high. You'll see it. When you talk about intersex, that's not identity expression as much as it is, this was a biological situation at birth, and the percentage is higher than we know, unless you've sat in some Gomez's workshops and you've learned it's the same as redheaded people. And you start to put these together and you realize the spectrums aren't 3 or 4 things. It's this vast universal spectrum with lines going different directions that we all fit in. So to claim straight as an identity is, if you were taking an SAT, white is to race as straight is to gender identity, sexual expression. They're both made up things. To maintain a majority over other people. And to make yourself a part of those who are accepted.
And so it's really interesting to me that you say that, because there's this test that organizations often use called the IDI, and it's about how an organization understands diversity. And it's one of those things where if a lot of organizations are really, really proud that they have gotten to a place where they think our differences don't matter. And they're shocked when they get the results back from this test that says, oh, that means on the spectrum, you're about 1/3 of the way along the spectrum towards being a really healthy organization when it comes to diversity. We've been trained into this notion of we're all the same is the ideal, when it's better than I hate other people or other groups of people, but it's the next step. It's not the end of that spectrum. And I found that fascinating because, you know, that notion of, you know, whiteness is this construct that's that's designed to build power and leave people out. That notion of we're all the same underneath does the same thing about consolidating power, because anybody who isn't feeling like they're part of that group is automatically marginalized.
Yes.
And there's pressure to repress anything that feels different, because the message there is different's bad. If we're all the same and you don't feel the same, you might be inclined to hide that you don't feel the same so that you can still stay part of the group. And that's how same retains its power. And so some of the work we have to do around our collective identity is realizing, oh, not just it's good that we're different, but our differences involve political power differentials. Our differences involve different forms of marginalization. Our experiences of marginalization aren't identical to each other, and it's okay to talk about that as long as we're not hierarchizing them. I think all of that's part of that mix. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Oh yeah, and one thing I can't really touch about is the power of the same. Because I am Mexican, I am gay, I am an immigrant, there is power with me standing out. because I get the eyes of people around me. But sometimes that power is scary in itself, because you don't want to be the attention of the whole group, because then you feel like they might hurt me, they might attack me. Because for me, luckily enough, or this is actually a double-edged sword, is though I am gay, I can become in the closet in certain situations. I can tone myself down, I can lose my color and be more, lower my shoulders, put my arms on my knees, and talk with a very clear enough voice. And that for many people will mean I am straight man. And that gives me a certain leverage or the sameness with them. But at the same point, I lose a bit of myself. I'm attacking myself in my own identity. And
yeah, there's a cost to your soul in doing that. Yeah.
There's a cost to reducing yourself.
Yeah.
You say it might be for my safety, and in all reality, depending on where you're at, it is part of being safe. If you have to be, the first thing about when coming out is learn your environment and know if you are safe to come out. Know if you're going to be losing your job because of it, and if it is worth losing your job for it. Yeah.
And there's where intersectionality becomes really important. I was just on a panel discussion about being Asian, queer, and Christian. And one of the things we talked about that I think is not distinct to that group, but is a different narrative than we were given by white queer community, is I wanted to make sure to say, it's okay for you not to be out, to figure out how to be out on your own terms, how to have the conversations you need, how to build up a community of support before you come out to your family. For some people, it's not actually viable to come out to their families. And we've been given one version of what coming out means and what queerness means that's also shaped by power and by a dominant notion of within this community, this is the one way to do it. And to realize, oh, my grandmother will lose her healthcare workers if I come out publicly. That means I have more than just myself to think about in that process.
Yes.
And I think intersectionality means we're having to deal with multiple realities at the same time.
Yeah, and there's also the kind of opposite where if you're super out, then you become a voice for every diverse, every minority, and in all reality, that's not quite true, because if, let's just simply say you're gay, or you're lesbian, or whatever group you're at, you can't speak for every other group.
Right.
You can simply say, hey, let's talk about it, let's have them inclusive in the group, but you can't simply say, hey, I speak for those groups. You can simply say, hey, as a personal minority, this is what only I think, and we can definitely include other people too. Because to simply state that we as a minority should speak for everyone else, in itself is kind of part of the one sameness.
Yeah,
Yeah, because
because it flattens us as well. Yeah, absolutely. Everybody gets reduced in that process.
Well, the other thing it does is it puts you in a position of justifying your existence. I mean, at what point do you have to be the one to talk about your own goodness and proclaim it? And what credibility do any of us feel to justify our own sameness and goodness? You know, there's the old Stuart Smalley on Saturday Night Live, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and daggone it, people like me. Okay, it's okay to try to convince yourself.
Yeah, he's doing that to the mirror.
It's the mirror. But when you're trying to tell society, no, I'm lovable and acceptable, you should accept me, well, you're biased in their mind.
Right.
The person who should be speaking up for that is the one who oppressed you in the first place. But we keep playing games with identity to protect those people from having to say anything. And then we lift up, oh, aren't they isn't he such a good Mexican gay man? He can speak for so many of them. And we know people don't all hold the same identities, and that doesn't even take all the complexity of who Jonathan is. It doesn't allow him to speak his authentic voice because he's too busy speaking on behalf of the community or other people's assumptions about that community. And then you add in the layer of religion. And that's the unique setting we're sitting in Rainbow Day today. Because we talk about Black church. We talk about Latinx Christianity. Whether it's Catholicism, Protestantism, there is a devotion. There is a culture that's built around that. And that adds another layer. Because then those of us who are out of the oppressive culture then we struggle to say anything to it because, you know, those of you who got colonized, you hold some beliefs that are really divisive and negative to you and negative to other people, and they're really judgmental. You all should stop doing what we taught you to do when we oppressed you and made you fall into those lines. We have no credibility to say that.
Well, and the other thing that I think is really funny about that, and I noticed this, so I should confess, I'm not United Church of Christ, I'm Disciples of Christ, the sister denomination. We had a big denominational decision in 2013, I want to say, about LGBTQ, formally adopting a denomination-wide LGBTQ affirmation position. And in the months leading up to it, there was this really horrific, the LGBT organization within the Disciples, which was pretty much a white organization, versus the Black and Latinx, and to some extent Asian Disciples, although the head of the Asian Disciples was like, hey, you don't get to call all Asians anti-gay. So that was the one group that was very intentional about saying, nope, we have a diversity of opinions within our community. But there was this people of color versus queer folks dynamic, and I wasn't publicly out at that point in time. My role within the conversation tended to be, hey, LGBTQ folks, have you noticed how you're acting like there are no queer people of color? And hey, people of color churches, do you notice how colonization has trained us into acting as if there are no queer people of color? So you're erasing part of your community in a very disingenuous way. You're acting like people of color are more backwards than white folks, when if every white person had voted against Prop 8 back in 2008, we wouldn't have had Prop 8, and yet people of color who were blamed, even though we were not yet the majority in California. This narrative of white, you know, it continues to perpetuate this kind of supremacy, because white people are like, but we have arisen. But statistically, no, that's not true. So the notion of blaming people of color for anti-gay views is still functioning out of white supremacy, because actually, if white folks who were LGBTQ affirming were working on other white folks, it would be moving the movement along quite a bit. And that's not where the energy is focused. Instead, the focus tends to be on us backwards people of color. Yeah, that was a long time. It wasn't a tirade, it was just I don't ever hear anybody talk about that weird assumption that goes unchecked most of the time. Yeah.
Well said.
Weird assumption.
Jonathan,
Do you mind saying?
No, it's just like all the other weird assumptions. It's just that, you know, I mean, I think contradictory assumptions are made constantly.
It's true.
And it really is very frustrating when you think, well, that's impossible. And as people are trying to rationalize it to you, they're being completely irrational. And I'm thinking, what am I missing? You know, but I guess that's maybe part of how people sort of protect themselves from having to take a step that challenges something that's kind of been baked in.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know.
Yeah, that's how we live with ourselves. That's
yeah,
a really
I think
good
at
point.
times, yeah, and sometimes I think, and for some people, it's different for everyone. There's even an awareness that you're doing it, but then to change that is too hard. And if you're in an environment that doesn't want you to change
That's a big
it
one.
ain't going to change. If you're in an environment that says, oh yeah, you could do this, or you could do that. So.
Which is why I think a day like today is so important. What this community is doing is so important.
somebody asked me once if I could define cognitive dissonance. I said, how many of you have ever been to church?
Was that all you said?
I said, because if you have, it's not hard to figure it out.
Right.
How many things do you believe that you know are not true? How many things do you believe you know aren't true?
Yeah.
You know all people are made in the image of God. But you also know that statistically it's easier to recruit for a white supremacist group in a church than at a Starbucks. So we clearly hold things we know are not true, and we act on them. They say that the more involved and longer you are invested in a predominantly white church, the more racist you tend to be statistically. And so we always hold on to things we know aren't true. We know that Scripture says don't judge lest you be judged. We know you're supposed to love everybody like you would love God and like your neighbor and yourself. But boy, are we really comfortable with condemnation. So it is a weird dynamic. And then I can play with it intellectually. But my friend Jonathan has to live it. With families with different religious backgrounds and different points of view. I don't have to live it out. That's my privilege. I can intellectualize it and play with it as an exercise. I'm curious, Jonathan, as we're talking about it, what's going on in you, because that's your journey.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So I've had to live both in a Christian, Catholic, Protestant, Baptist kind of environment. So there are different kind of playrooms and sandboxes you can play with. But I think the whole
At times, yeah, and sometimes I think, and for some people, it's different for everyone. There's even an awareness that you're doing it, but then to change that is too hard. And if you're in an environment that doesn't want you to change it,
That's a big
it ain't
part.
gonna change. If you're in an environment that says, oh yeah, you could do this, or you could,
Yeah.
so.
Which is why I think a day like today is so important. What this community is doing is so important.
Somebody asked me once if I could define cognitive dissonance. I said, how many of you have ever been to church?
Was that all you said?
Yeah. Yeah.
I said, because if you have, it's not hard to figure it out.
Right.
How many things do you believe that you know are not true? How many things do you believe you know aren't true?
Yeah.
You know all people are made in the image of God. But you also know that statistically it's easier to recruit for a white supremacist group in a church than at a Starbucks. So we clearly hold things we know are not true, and we act on them. They say that the more involved and longer you are invested in a predominantly white church, the more racist you tend to be statistically. And so we always hold on to things we know aren't true. We know that Scripture says don't judge lest you be judged. We know you're supposed to love everybody like you would love God and like your neighbor and yourself. But boy, are we really comfortable with condemnation. So it is a weird dynamic. And then I can play with it intellectually. But my friend Jonathan has to live it. With families with different religious backgrounds and different points of view. I don't have to live it out. That's my privilege. I can intellectualize it and play with it as an exercise. I'm curious, Jonathan, as we're talking about it, what's going on in you, because that's your journey.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So I've had to live both in a Christian, Catholic, Protestant, Baptist kind of environment. So there are different kind of playrooms and sandboxes you can play with. But I think the whole argument is going to us versus them. The us as a group trying to view them as equal. And for a lot of people, that is the hardest thing. To view others who have different cultures, identities, religion, even what you do at Christmas. How you celebrate Christmas can make you an us versus them. Some will view celebrating Christmas is not Christmas without a turkey. Some of it is not without ham. Some of it is not without those itty bitty things that we learn as we grow up. And because of this is, we learn that, yeah, some people might do it differently, but to us, that is wrong. Even though we should actually know, like, no, that's their habit. That's how they grew up. That's how they learn things. That's their culture. But we don't want to accept it as equal, because then if they're equal, does that make us less? In all reality, it doesn't. But then you're kind of in the high school phase where, like, hey, if I'm not above then I'm lower. And I don't want to be lower, so I attack.
In a world of binaries, the choices are better or worse, not
Yeah.
the same. Yeah. Yeah, I grew up in a household where we left mince pies and sherry for for Father Christmas. And because I got made fun of for that at school, and by Santa, the first time I visited him in this country, my mother made sure to let me know Santa Claus preferred mincemeat and sherry. So I was better than all those kids who just left him crummy cookies and milk. Trained to internalize superiority young.
And doesn't that also mean your parents aren't choking down cookies and milk in the middle of the night? You got to put out the good stuff for us.
My parents didn't eat it. Santa, to this day, Santa always eats them, and I always get a stocking. I don't know what you're talking about. But yes, your point that, yeah, there's this notion of we've got to figure out who's on top and who's on bottom because there's only two choices.
Yeah, would equality be so bad? That's kind of what the question we kind of got.
That would be a great t-shirt.
Yeah, is equality so bad? And one thing that I kind of really see is, let me ask you a question, and let's see if you feel or not. Have you ever had to diminish yourself based on your sex? Did you ever have to say, oh, because he's a man, and you just internalize that too quickly? Did you ever have to say, step back because of your age? Did you ever have to step back because you were Christian or believe in religion? Did you ever have to step back because they say they were Republican? Though every single time you feel like you have to back down or put yourself lower than them is intersectionality. And
Because of who has power.
who has the power? Who do you believe, or who do you want to give the power to? Because power is all mental, really. Like a community, we all say, hey, we all want to share our power. And then we elect someone to say, hey, I want to give my power to him. He represents me. So, yeah, I'll go back to the session. So, when you believe that you put a pound down, you're brought down because of it. You're kind of feeling the same thing that most other people will feel. And if you can simply say, hey, this feeling of being put down is not good, you can share that. You can simply empathize with another person and make them equal to you.
I like the idea. I also think what Ellie was raising connects with it because that's also affected by what our community believes matters, right?
Yes.
So it's one thing for me to say, I'm just as good even though I'm an immigrant. And if I can say that to someone else and they're like, oh, okay, I didn't realize, or I just don't back down, that's one thing. But if I grew up in Akron, Ohio, it didn't matter how many times I said immigrants are just as good. There was a whole community that was like, no, you are the reason that none of us have jobs anymore. It is the immigrants' fault, right? The tire industry failed because of you. It's not as easy for me to really internalize that message, and it creates barriers, right? So paying attention to community power and how we respond to that is also part of it.
Social pressure, really.
Social pressure, yep. Yep.
I'm realizing the connectivity with a process we went through for our second Rainbow Day. The first one we kind of learned what to do. The second one we did some training for ourselves beforehand. And we came up with a sheet of all the different identities that we hold.
Mm-hmm.
Geographic, socioeconomic, ethnic, gender, religion, professional, vocational, parent, family roles, all of this. And you're supposed to fill it in. To identify each one for you. How would you describe it? And then we ranked them when it comes to what order they most define you. And we did it, we said, and some of them we were able to name, well, this is more important to some people because they're oppressed over it. So my identity as male isn't first and foremost in my mind because no one else makes a big deal out of it. What I hadn't really thought of is that it's not just that women have that identity elevated because they're being oppressed by it, It's that their identity is now shaped as much by the outside as it is internally.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
That there's not even a choice of your identity. You don't get to prioritize. The world's prioritizing your identity for you. And there's a complexity to that reflection that did not hit me until I'm listening to this. I think next year, if we do that again, we need to not only rank them, we also need to mark which ones we're choosing and which ones are being societally elevated on our behalf.
One of my mentors, as an anti-racism trainer, his name's Chris Hobgood, and he was a white man who had done desegregation work in Virginia, just amazing history of work. And his favorite saying was, being white means never having to think about it. And what he was saying was, actually my white identity matters as much and I'm judged by it just as much as you are by your Asian identity and your immigration status. It's just because it's of benefit to me, I never have to think about it. But it turns out, I don't think it's as important, but it's just as important for me as yours is for you. I thought that was, yeah, so that's very much what you're saying, and I think that's an interesting way of looking at it is, I'm only aware of my privilege as English being my first language because my father, that wasn't true for, and I watched the discrimination he faced. If I hadn't experienced that, I wouldn't think about the fact that English being my first language gives me all sorts of benefits that a lot of people don't have. So yeah, I appreciate you saying that.
And in our research on Gen Z, right now, for the first time in history of sociological study on generations, gender identity and expression is in the top 4 of identifying markers. Up there with family, school, friends. It's never been that high, and church and religious identity has gone down. It's been bumped. And people say, well, why? Why is this? Are they more sexualized? You know, no, statistically, they are the most prudish generation that we've had since World War I. Most pragmatic, everything else. They don't get their license until later, you know, they don't drink, they don't have sex, probably because they don't have a license. But part of it is,
This is California. Everything is too expensive here. Living here is expensive. Breathing air here is expensive.
but that gender identity creeps up there partially because they're allowed to explore it.
Yeah.
And they're at an age where they haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah.
Their gender identity will become less a part of their identity once they know what it is, and they settled into it. But it's when we are challenged by our identity, when we're made to feel like it's not okay, when we're insecure with ourselves, it comes up. It's more important because it's pressing right now. And at a time when you're dating and you're connecting and you're trying on relationships, of course it's important. Of course it gets elevated. And if people were honest in every generation before, they were worried about it too. You just weren't allowed to put it on the surface.
Right. And there were only 2 options you were allowed to consider.
And there were only 2 options. And that was a buffet.
Do you think that some of this also has to do with where we find community also shapes where we locate our identity? Because for me, the greatest gift of publicly identifying as queer, and especially as a queer person of color, was this amazing community that I got to plug into in a very different way. And I wonder if gender exploration creates a built-in community, I think. It's been my experience. And I wonder if, as we look at the things that people prioritized on that list, also, some of the things they prioritized were because, well, that's where my people are. And that might be religion, it might be church, it might be other things as well.
And as more people come out, there is a community of support where you can claim it.
Yep.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It becomes the church.
Yeah. Which is what I was thinking about when we were watching the video on being gender nonconforming and Latinx, was several of them were like, it is glorious getting to live in this other space. It is amazing. And they were talking about authenticity, they were also talking about community.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one thing about even being LGBT community, there is kind of a stigma against religion because a lot of people have been so hurt by it.
Yes.
Yep. And you kind of have to pick your moments to say, oh yeah, hey, I also go to church.
It's
Because-
another coming out process.
Yeah, it's a coming out process within a coming out process. It's a very much experience. Because you have to say, oh yes, and I'm still Christian, I'm still Jewish, or I'm still like, you're still stating that you have religion and you're in the LGBT community. And one thing I'm realizing now is before there was a very big stigma against it, and now slowly, as people are kind of stating, yeah, I still want to keep my faith and my sexual identity, and it's slowly starting to improve. But there's still a big need of people coming out in the LGBT community saying, hey, yes, I love what you give to me. I love being part of you. I love all that you give me, but I also have this other part of me that you might not agree with, you might have been abused by, but it's still a part of me, and I want to be part of both.
Do you know what's interesting is I found that this, in my entire life, this season, about 5 years that I've been out, has ended up being the closest I've been to what, my evangelical friends would call as like testimony and witness, is by living as a queer Asian Christian. Within my South Asian community, there are people who are like, oh, I thought I had to abandon Hinduism to be progressive, but you're showing me this other way of being. Oh, because I'm queer, I didn't think there was a space for me in the Muslim community, but now I'm realizing. So there's been this amazing experience I've had of getting to kind of have my life be a witness to being able to integrate those things when a lot of the time those things have to be compartmentalized for folks, and that's been kind of beautiful to watch happen.
Compartmentalize seems like a very gentle way to say it.
Well,
And I'm wondering if it's amputation, if it's abandonment. For those of you who had to walk that journey and you didn't feel like intersectionality was accepted, that you weren't allowed to experience both at the same time, what is that? How would you describe that?
For me personally, that is the closest I can get to descriptive words would be when I have to lie or hide or bring back myself. I feel like someone is just going into my heart. It's a bony hand that's grabbing icicle and is slowly squeezing it. It's not a permanent sharp attack. It's just slowly squeezing it. It is taking part of me and just saying no. It's blinding out the light to that section of me. It's kind of like repression, a short-term repression depending on how long the situation is. But even after you've done it, after you've compartmentalized and can be free again, you still feel it. Because you whip yourself, you kind of put yourself in a box and you kind of broken your bones to fit in there. The trauma might be greater at that point, but you're still feeling it afterwards as you're trying to heal yourself from it too.
yeah, I don't think I can say it better.
Yeah, the repression of self, that's powerful. Questions for those who are present of the really two insightful people and the last